fun, trust me, with Duo Dickinson, author, architect of A Home Called New England. And we're going to get to that in a second. Okay, Duo Dickinson.
Yes, sir.
You've got a million different degrees.
No, I only have one.
Well, you have a million. Anyway, so you do a lot of pro bono work.
Yeah.
You've built a lot of homes.
Yeah.
You've done a lot of books. Let's start with why your name is Duo Dickinson.
Right. There's a weird reality that is being slowly genetically removed from our culture, which is this book, A Home Called New England. This book actually talks about the Puritans came. And the Puritans came, and then their descendants came, and other people came. They're all from England. And that became the white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, because they came here because they were not Catholics. They were fleeing in a lot of the times the actual Catholicism that came and went from Europe for 100 years. And they came here because the Calvinists weren't, and the Anglo-Saxons.
You're not describing why Duo.
Well, I am.
George.
I am. No, I am.
That.
This is.
Okay.
This is the.
You're pulling us in.
This is the deep background that bores everyone and makes you change the channel. So, there we are. So, but the bottom line is that WASPs, the white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. My wife, by the way, has 13 relatives on the Mayflower. I, on the other hand, am somebody that came over in the vessel of my grandfather when he wanted to play professional soccer in 1903. So I'm not really that waspy, but WASPs never call their children by their given name. Now, your new grandchild is named Bodie.
Correct.
And what was my first response? Oh, Bodie. What does Bodie stand for?
Is it after someone?
Or is it a change? Or, no, that's his name. So flash back, actually, from the Puritans, flash forward, but flash back from our conversation to when my first child, our first child, my wife will never forgive me, our first child, William Morrison Dickinson, is born. We consciously were naming him after a man named Will Clarkson. So my thought was, well, we'll name him Will Dickinson. And my wife says, yes. And I go, okay, Will Dickinson. Yes, William Morrison Dickinson. No, Will Dickinson. So this goes back and forth, and then I realized there's a genetic sieve. So I am Duo Dickinson because I could have been Trip Dickinson, Flip Dickinson, Buzz Dickinson, Blip Dickinson. I mean, I like W. Basically, no WASP. My brother, who just passed, was named Winthrop Stevens Dickinson, Win. My sister, Suzanne Hill Dickinson, Susie. My dad, George Arthur Dickinson, Dickie. So we're never really...
So who thought of Duo?
Before I was born, they said, Junior is lame, and you, Dad, are George. You can't call him George. Latin, Duo.
Duo.
Before I was even born.
Okay, so that was 10 minutes or so.
So we got another hour or two.
Yeah, so now we got to get to the book.
Oh, the book.
All right, how many books have you written in your career?
8.
8.
Well, I've co-authored 2, written 6.
And this is number 8 or number 9?
This is number 8.
This is number 8. A Home Called New England.
Right.
You want the reader to know what about this
book?
Oh, God. And we should stand this up. Yeah.
This is not a book that was written by historians. This is not a book that is a best-of book. This is a book that's written by 2 people, me and Steve Culpepper, an incredibly interesting editor guy who's written a bunch of books also. 2 people that did not grow up in New England. I grew up in Madmen Land in Westchester, and he grew up in Louisiana. So we didn't know this place, and we both came here at the same time, early 80s, late 70s. And we sort of both sensed this place has a tooth and a pungency and a reality which is not present in almost any institution other than to say about the history of New England or the best pizza in New Haven or some other thing which categorizes it not by its culture and by the nature of this people and the history, but by things and dates and stuff. So in this book, which is 320 pages, by the way, and
it's a beautiful
and has
book.
400 illustrations, we talk about 60 different people. We talk about maybe 80 different homes. We talk about different eras, 5 separate epochs that go through the first 400 years. And actually, the first chapter is actually about the previous 1,000 years of Indian culture in America. We take the entire sweep of all of that time, and we actually make it as something which is relevant, funny sometimes, but also quick and easy, broken up into about 150 little snippets that you could read while you're waiting for the toast to be done in the morning. It's not like it's this tome that you want to kill yourself to figure out who is having a baby with. Yes.
Yeah. All right. So you picked this book, this cover. Maybe you picked it.
No.
The editor did.
The editor did.
This is one of the oldest houses.
The stone
around.
house, the
In
Whitfield
Guildford.
house in Guildford, yep, from 1640, I think, or 16 something, and it's essentially the greatest single stone home left from the 17th century. And the other thing is, it's not only a national historic site, it's also a national archaeologic site, because they've actually gone into it and figured out the deep background of who lived there and what they were doing. And it's really one of the great, people should go see it. It's a state park. It's been closed for some time when the state's had trouble financially, but I think it's still open on weekends, and it's a great thing. Right in downtown Guildford. It's easy to get to.
Home building in New England over the centuries. Kind of take me through it.
That is such a great question. That was, in a way, how we started this book. We started this book thinking about the fact that the Puritans that came here and the other wild Anglo-Saxon Protestant nut jobs that wanted to flee were really directly analogous today to the Scientologists. People that were part of the culture but were felt separate from it. People that had a way of thinking about spirituality that people were a little bit suspicious of. People that were working and living with other people in the Anglican Church or the Catholic Church, but usually the Anglican Church, which was brand new back then. And they were saying, I don't fit in. This is not what I want. I want to be able to worship this way and live this way and live my life the way I worship. And they went to America basically as if you or I would go to Mars. It was that far away. It was insane how crazy it was to go to America if you were part of 17th century Britain. And they oftentimes would stop off in Belgium first or the Netherlands first because they were trying to find some place to practice their religion, which back then religion really was who you were. It was totally ingrained in who you were, who you married, who you lived with, everything. So when they came to America, they ended up landing in a place that had nothing. So their first houses were tents, just to keep the rain off and to keep the bears away, and just tents. As they didn't die, and as they scavenged and then made some more stuff to eat and actually began a little bit of commerce or bartering or something, they were able to build houses with foundations and maybe made out of real wood. But the typical house from the late 17th century was essentially a one-room house with a stone fireplace in it, maybe 400 or 500 square feet. There was a loft where everybody slept, and there was a room on the first floor that you cooked, ate, made children in, watched grandma die in. Everything happened in this one place, and it was during, and this is what makes this book, I think, interesting, this was really during the Little Ice Age. We forget it even happened. The Little Ice Age happened from the 17th century really through the 19th century. A lot of people think it was caused by the fact that sunspot activity had a record low for about 80 years during that time. And the temperature could be said to be almost 20 degrees lower than it is now on most given winter days. And the growing season that was short anyway became incredibly short. So the houses had to hold heat. They had very few windows. They had very large fireplaces. So as people got to be beyond the survivalist thing of eating and protection, they would make bigger and nicer houses. Typically what they would do is just add to the house they had, because why would you move? You've got all the land you want. You're here. And you've got 6 kids, 2 are going to die, but the other one's maybe going to have a kid. And it was a different mindset. You're surviving in place. So you fast forward, what architects like to talk about really is the fact that different stylistic things happened in Europe. And because we're kind of a Me Too culture in America, we're always looking to the Western civilization to say that we're legitimate. So we want to imitate things from Western civilization. So we imitate architectural styles. Well, once we stopped being killed by animals and disease and famine, we began to say, well, we're people too. And so they looked first to Adam style. There's an English architect named Adam, not Adams, but Adam, who actually did a very aesthetic, clean, neoclassicist style. It was not Tudorish, it wasn't from the medieval time, it wasn't really Renaissance, it was just clean and simple, and we sort of glommed on that. And from that little thing of saying, wait, we can control this. You don't have to build the house my grandfather built or my great-grandfather built. I can actually design a house and move it. It was a time that architects were almost happening back then. So what ends up really happening is a whole cascade of styles happens, really starting with Andrew Jackson
while you're talking, I'm going to go through this.
With this guy Downing, who wrote a book that was essentially a plan book. And in that book, they could do something called picturesque architecture. They would take an Italianate villa, or they would take a French chateau, or they would take a German Tyrolean building. You know, these are some of the older buildings. This is actually the oldest house in America from 1641. It's 1637. It's the oldest timber frame house in America. And you could actually begin to sort of see how as you go through the book, how they changed. And this is a really terrible book to be an editor from. I mean, here's a great example of a villa. There are buildings just like this in New Haven. If you go to Hill House Avenue, you'll see a million of them. And that's part of the picturesque movement. And you'll see there's a Victorian, and there's this sort of Italianate thing. There's a mansard roof. And you'll see there's a stick-style house. And there's this, and we were able to do this thing where we could take Roseland Cottage, which is a 6,000 square foot house in New England, and just have a little talk about it, look about it. And then if you want to go to the internet and take a look at it. But there are over 100 houses in here, they follow this sweep. So what ends up happening is all these different styles happen, going from shingle style to stick style to Richardsonian, Romanesque, to all these different styles, which you've looked at and said, oh yeah, I know that house, to something actually I find more interesting. And that was a book. We have a little chapter on this book called Big House, Little House, Back House, Barn. And it was a teacher, I think, at the University of Oregon. And he basically, named Hammond, I think, and he went through a study of these homes that were built to survive, tents, in northeast New Hampshire and southwest Maine. And it was this cluster, back in the Little Ice Age, where you literally had 3 months to grow stuff, and then you survive the rest of the time. And they began to get, as they began to survive better, they began to have livestock. So the livestock had to go somewhere when it was cold, or they would die and you'd have to eat them, and then you'd starve to death because they were gone, not making eggs, not making milk. They were just, you know, so they would create a barn. Well, to get to the barn, there's 3 feet of snow on the ground. It's kind of tough. So you'd make a connection. Well, then you'd also say, well, I've got to feed these people, so maybe I should make another little saddle bag off to the side, and there'll be some corn in there, or there'll be some other feed in there. And then they said, well, while we're at it, this is over several generations, they not only connected the house to the barn, but they expanded the barn to actually make places to store food, to actually have different cottage industries. And so you have these homes that started from little tiny boxes in northern eastern New England that grew and grew and grew. Little house, big house, back house, barn. And they just grew, and because the vernacular architecture is so adaptive, they could almost seamlessly grow and feel comfortable in how large they were.
As an architect for about 40 years?
Yeah, 40 years.
40 years.
30 on my own.
What have you learned through this book about Connecticut?
Well, not about Connecticut, because I think Connecticut, I knew, because I was in Connecticut. What I really didn't know, and I really didn't have the ability to assimilate, was how pungent New England is. How there is this bizarre, it's very moving to me, this bizarre elemental gist of, for a very few people now, but elemental into the culture is the gist of religious expression, of personal belief that things are more important than the laws that are over here or the culture that's over there. It's me and God. And that's how this whole thing started. And that transition, which only lasted a few generations, because it's really hard to really get into hell and brimstone when you're, trying to cook and eat and date.
Survive.
And so what ends up happening is that transitions away, and the love of God transitions pretty easily into a love of freedom. Because we weren't in England. We were making things that were really useful to us, and we began to realize that we'd picked the bad place to farm. Because of the glaciers, stones had been crushed into the ground, dirt had been scraped away, and there are 3 or 4 great places to grow in New England. They're all river valleys. Vermont River Valley, the one in, not Vermont, but the Connecticut River Valley, and the one that's over in Rhode Island. And there's beautiful, wonderful soil there, about 5% of the entire population. And as the population grew and they stopped doing subsistence farming, what people don't remember here is, they don't remember it, is that from the Revolutionary War until the Civil War, 50% of all forests were clear-cut. Clear-cut. So we built huge farms that had terrible production, and people were starving to death and not really great at doing that. And so they actually then focused on agriculture as a technological thing to do. As that was all happening, they began to realize these rivers are going crazy because the rivers are accepting water like crazy because of all these rocks that are stuffed into the ground, and there's rocky terrain, but there's no absorption of the water. The water's just flowing. And so one river in Massachusetts drops 300 feet over about like 8 miles. So
You've given us a history lesson in this book.
Yeah, well, it's
like
also,
a lot of them.
I would almost call it an anecdotally linked lesson. In other words, it isn't like in 1923, someone's, it's like, wow, that guy's cool. Wow, that building's cool. Wow, this is interesting.
And then go look further.
And I try to tie together, well, and Steve tried together these 5 epochs to say that if you look at the whole reality of New England, you see that those rocks made water, that made technology, that made innovation, that then mandated education. So you went from a place that was survivalist, that becomes the education capital, maybe of the world, in this tiny little place. The most educated, the least spiritual, most productive part of America, where it doesn't really matter what you believe as long as you can do something. And a good friend of mine, not a good friend, a friend of mine from the Midwest said, you know, I'm really sick, Duo, whenever I see you. I say, why? He says, you don't ask me, how am I? You ask me, what am I doing?
Okay.
But no, they don't like, I mean, most people care how you feel, how you're doing. In New England, we care about, no, what are you doing? Justify. What's going on? And because we live by our acts, and I think there's a direct, almost genetic linkage between the living by your acts of surviving in these tents on this crummy soil, trying to live, and living by your wits and making things happen in a place that wasn't harboring you well and was not easy. And it makes for enormous creativity, incredible intellectual creativity.
Did you learn more about human nature writing this, or did you already have a real grip on human nature?
Well, I have to say that the focus of humanity was such that by doing these 50 little biographies of people, I learned that I'm no different than Samuel F.B. Morse. I'm no different than Harriet Beecher Stowe. I'm no different than Emily Dickinson. The same stuff that happens to these long dead people is in all of us. And they were able to take these things, because you don't just read about what they did, which is what a New Englander might do. You learned about how they felt and why they felt that way. The fact that, you know, you could be almost a savant like F.B. Morse was, or you could be, you know, a little bit crazy like any number of people were, like P.T. Barnum, who wrote his funeral, what was it, 2 years before he died, and was published in the New York Times. Or you're Harriet Beecher Stowe, and you end up making a book that, because the press had just been perfected, ends up selling 100,000 copies and changing the course of world history by making slavery, gets interesting, slavery, which manifests the core Christian belief of the Puritans, which that every human being is made in the image of God, takes that simple truth, which you asked a Southerner in 1840, is every human being made in the image of God? Why, sure he is. Well, then why do you have slaves? Would you like some tea? I mean, the basic disconnect between the values people purported to have in America and the act of slavery, which was completely cauldronized in New England. This was the place where you would have people giving guns and money to abolitionists that weren't in New England, because we didn't have any slaves. What did we know? And because we didn't have slaves, by the way, we became the #1 immigration port in America. Because if we didn't have slaves, you didn't need cheaper free labor. We had to get free labor from somewhere else. So tons of Irish and other people in Europe came to America to work in 1840, 1850, before the Civil War, because we needed cheap labor. So we opened it up so that they could come. So if you're freeing humanity by following the Word of God, and you are fighting and dying to save that ineffable quality of the human spirit which you want to preserve, and you believe in abolition, the jump which so many New Englanders went to the transcendentalist movement, where they would talk about women's suffrage. Here, you could say it's in upstate New York, but almost all the big stuff happens right here. The stuff about temperance, the fact that alcohol was this agent of the dark side of all humanity, that also was there. These radical social, political efforts that were actually created in the wake of the Puritans, who lived their life simply by saying, I'm going to follow God. Well, I'm going to follow what I believe. And that transitioned into, I will follow innovation. I will make the cotton gin. I mean, the cotton gin. Before the cotton gin was invented, the South had 800,000 slaves. 1820 or 1812, the cotton gin explodes there and it starts to produce enormous amounts of cotton. By the time of the Civil War, they had 2.5 million Africans living in the South. So Eli Whitney created the culture that created the Civil War from New Haven.
All comes back to Connecticut in some way. I point out that you've been an architect for almost 40 years. How do you see architecture today?
Oh my God. Well,
I mean, from Frank Lloyd Wright, you know, all these important guys. How do you see architecture today? What are we doing in this country? And this comes off the book a little bit.
The cool thing about this book is we had a very interesting publisher. The publisher had published 4 of my other books. My co-author had been a senior editor at that publishing house. They knew that we knew about stuff, and they knew that we could make books. So they kind of gave us free hand. So I said to my co-author, well, I can handle all this other stuff, but if I don't deal with contemporary New England architecture, this is not a complete book. So part of this book is about 20 pages about new architects, young architects, vital architects, making buildings that if you saw them, like Jeremiah Eck or Jim Estes, if you saw their work in here, you would say, well, that's in New England. And it's modern as hell. You say, no, it's in New England. Well, the reason why architecture is in trouble, and it really is in trouble, I mean, I can run down the list.
Because everything has changed.
Everything has changed, but it's also there are 200,000 people with architecture degrees, and there are maybe 80,000 jobs. So that's number one. But also, like medicine some, like law totally, because of the technological revolution, the way I design buildings and create them with the staff of like 6 or 8 people has completely and totally changed completely by cyberspace, by going from tangible mylar drawings that you trace with a pencil or a pen to essentially clicking on a mouse. And I don't do the clicking because I'm too old, I don't know how. I've got people that click that I look at. So I'm detached from all of that. But in my little office, we still make models of everything, physical models. I don't trust the computer to draw three-dimensionally. I trust it to draw so you can build something, but not to actually design something. So we're still designing things, and people still want, I mean, even in a recession, I've built over 800 things, and you know, people are still doing things, but people are scareder now because I think they saw that in the 4 building booms that I've went through, 4 since I graduated, bad decisions were made because we weren't thinking about what a building was or what we valued. We were thinking about what should my house be? How do I keep up with the Joneses? Or, gee, I really want to have this sexy feature of some solar gain or something that I like, and not really thinking about what I really value. What is it? And you know, instead of thinking like your car, that your mortgage payment is affordable, like your car payment's affordable, you think about what does this actually cost? Well, sometimes these homes cost so much more than they're worth, or they did. And then recessions come through and they shake stuff up and it makes things real again. So this is the 3rd and protracted recession I've gone through. We've always had the same number of people. I've never laid a single person off. I've never missed a payroll. So in the profession, there are people that are pretty good at essentially making a business, but making a business and trying to build beauty is really difficult.
One last question. What are you most proud of as an architect? You get this question probably all the time, but was it a little house that you built, or was it a barn, or what was it? What I would have
said, and this is true, I would have said, because it's self-serving, I would have said, because I'm an egomaniac, I would have said the house that,
You're going to actually say that you are that?
Well, if you are that, maybe you're not, but still. I can say that my own house was a big deal, and it won several national awards, and it was cool, and you've been there. It's a nice place. It's a nice place. But, no. Sorry. Family. We did a chapel. I'm on the board of something called the Incarnation Center up in Ivoryton, Connecticut. And I went there 46 years ago as a camper. And it's on this Bushy Hill Lake, mile-long lake. And it's an Episcopal camp, and I'm sadly completely woven into the Episcopal Church in Connecticut.
And we can get into that in another show. Yeah.
So, of course, they say, we have to build a new chapel. The old chapel's falling down. I said, okay, fine. I said, but it has to be 3 times as large. I said, well, why does it have to be 3 times as large? Well, it just does. We have $180,000, which for a thing that seats 340 people is nothing, right? It's an outdoor chapel, doesn't have heat, but it wants to be nice. It wants to be beautiful. So I do this thing, we get it done, like all these other pro bono. You know, a third of the work I do in my office starts out as pro bono, and
congratulations for that. You've made the world a better place.
I could show you some scars. But anyway, we did all of that, and then the other board members were, and we were all called to come down to a service or to a gathering there, which we had. It was a year old. We'd gone there, we'd done all the normal things you do with a new building, but we never really saw how it was used day to day. So we were there, and then we start seeing the kids come down, and they dress up, and they come down to a volunteer Sunday afternoon service, and the kids fill the place to overflowing. Now they're looking down and they're looking out over the lake, and the kids just start to sing "Lean on Me," like it's the greatest song in the world. And I'm standing there next to these other old people, and I just go, this is why I'm alive.
Because
I've given a place.
Made that. Yeah.
Well, I didn't make it. They made it. But the place allowed them to be more than themselves. They became something infinitely large because they felt that the harbor responded to their visceral love. That actually meant a lot, and it won a lot of awards and stuff, but it didn't, that was nothing compared to seeing those kids effervesce, and they're in a building.
You're an emotional guy, Duo.
I played football for a while, so yeah.
Yeah. Again, the book is A Home Called New England. You'll learn a lot. Thank you, Duo, so much
Love
for
being
coming
here,
on. Appreciate it.
Spend all night kissing, and if was right here, then who else is missing? Got a little sidetracked if I'm a wishing and found the keys to the door, but it's also a metaphor. Things keep locked in the grocery store, but mine just to save time. Skip right ahead to the last ride.